ever since the 3rd of November, or perhaps, in fact, much longer than that. Before I introduce them, let me remind you that you can send us your questions to the following email address, actividades@realcano.org, or via our Twitter feed using the hashtag #DebatesElcano. So we have with us today, as I was saying, 4 excellent speakers, some of whom will be extremely, or all of whom will be extremely well known to you. First of all, I will be handing over to Jeffrey Michaels. Jeffrey is a senior fellow in American foreign policy and international security at the Institut d'Estudis Nord-Americans. I hope, Jeff, you will acknowledge my excellent Catalan there. And he is currently based at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. So thank you, Jeff, for joining us. We also have with us Heather Conley. She is Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Heather, for taking time out to take part in this event. We also have with us Daniel Hamilton, whom I haven't seen in a little while. Daniel is Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Europe Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Thank you for joining us, Dan. And finally, last but by no means least, our very own homegrown Carlota Garcia Encina, who is our Senior Analyst for US Affairs and Transatlantic Relations. So thank you all for joining us. And let me also thank all of those who are following us from Spain, from the United States, and elsewhere in the world for your interest. So my first question to all of you refers to President Trump's legacy, or multiple legacies, in the foreign policy arena. I think in the wake of the election results, or at least according to some observers, there's been a tendency to be slightly flippant about the Trump administration, in the sense that some people seem to be regarding it as a sort of hiccup, a sort of major road accident that we can quickly digest and get over, and everything will be back to normal, if you like, or back to the pre-2016 situation. I personally don't adhere to that view, as you can probably tell from the tone of my question and the tone of my voice, but I'd be very interested to hear your views on this. So over to you, first of all, Jeff. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Charles, for the very kind invitation to speak here, and may I also compliment you on your flawless Catalan as well. So to get to your question, I mean, I think historians looking back on the Trump presidency and its role in international affairs, what will be remembered about this period is that it wasn't about America dealing with crises elsewhere. This was about America creating crises rather than responding to them, which was very different from the Obama presidency, and very different from what I'm sure we'll see under a Biden presidency as well. Though having said that, one could also argue that the U.S. has been creating crises for many years, and especially after 9/11, and that the crisis of the Trump presidency was a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind. In many important respects, the Trump administration's foreign policy was very much a topsy-turvy affair, giving the cold shoulder to allies while openly embracing authoritarian leaders. Instead of the tradition of touting U.S. leadership, America became increasingly viewed as withdrawing from world affairs, undermining international institutions, pulling out of treaty commitments. And for American allies, this was 4 years of holding one's breath and praying that there would be a new leader in 2021. And to get to your point, I think more generally there was a sense of cognitive dissonance. Everyone pretending or hoping that all will return to normal after this time of troubles. One of the adjectives I would use to describe Trump's foreign policy is emptiness. This was the administration of diplotainment, the big media event devoid of substance. Trump was good at wrecking things, but he couldn't build anything. This was the deal maker who didn't actually make any deals. There weren't any grand bargains. For someone who once wanted to be seen as the great deal maker on arms control, for example, nothing happened on Russia or North Korea or Iran. In fact, the situation is much worse now than it was 4 years ago. Now, in terms of the question about institutional impact on the State Department specifically, I think was profound on at least three different levels. Firstly, the individuals he hired to run the State Department. Neither Rex Tillerson nor Mike Pompeo had any love for the Foreign Service. Both tried to massively cut its budget, and this had a negative effect on morale, nor was the expertise of the Foreign Service viewed favorably in the White House. In fact, the White House openly derided the Foreign Service as part of this deep state. I think secondly, the administration forced U.S. diplomats to be on permanent damage control alert for the last 4 years, especially every time Trump had something positive to say about authoritarian leaders and his criticism of democratic leaders and U.S. allies. And thirdly, his legacy of undermining the U.S. reputation around the world will force U.S. diplomats to work even harder now in the years ahead, once he's gone, trying to rebuild trust in America and this belief that America is not going to fall back to what it has been in the last 4 years come 2025. I think this leads me to my final point, which is that in some important respects, to be honest, it's simply too early to talk about a Trump legacy, not just because of the lame duck period, which, as you probably follow the news in the last days, some talk about bombing Iran and things like this, and withdrawing more troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think the Trump legacy is still going to be with us for quite some time, especially if there's the looming prospect of Trump returning to the White House in 2025. And this is something that I hadn't really given much thought to prior to the election, but increasingly it's sort of dominating my thinking about the foreign policy for the years ahead. Because I think at the very least, Trump is going to be a pain in the neck for the next several years, and it's going to hamper U.S. foreign policy as a result, despite the best efforts of the administration to try to at least assess the damage in the first instance, try to recover from the shock of the last 4 years, and then to move on. So I think, it's still a bit too early to talk about a legacy just yet, because I think Trump's going to be with us for quite some time to come.
Thank you very much. Heather, over to you.
Well, Charles, thank you so much. It's great to be with my fellow panelists. I hope everyone's safe and well. I think the most challenging part of being an analyst is sort of taking our strong emotions and how difficult the last 4 years and trying to parse that out and trying to understand what really is the legacy behind it. So I'm going to try to, separate out President Trump from this conversation and just really focus on the policy. So I have, about 5 areas where I think there is already significant legacy from the Trump administration. The first happened with really for the United States, and our security policy was shifting away from counterterrorism as a framing of our entire national security apparatus, which had been the case since September the 11th, and really re-gearing this to great power competition. Now, that in some ways was a legacy of, former National Security Advisor General McMaster and his staff. And again, President Trump, I think, although it was his strategy and he approved his strategy, he didn't follow his own strategy in his words and his actions. But that I can't begin to tell you how everything shifted. And now we view global engagement, for better or for worse, through this great power competition lens. And that's significant. The second significance is China. And in some ways, the clarity, again, moving President Trump out of this, because there's always question marks, he tramples over his own policy many times, that there is now strong bipartisan consensus that China is America's most significant challenge in the future, both from an economic standpoint, as well as a security standpoint, as well from a whole range of human rights, international legal framing. This will not change. This is strong and bipartisan. And I think that has been a shift that has happened under this administration's watch. There is more continuity than I think we all would like to acknowledge in U.S. foreign policy. And this is as much as the effort has been very challenging. And certainly the decision 48 hours ago that President Trump said about, again, very quickly withdrawing more troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. This is where I think elements of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are going to meet. It's ending those endless wars. The United States has not had an effective exit strategy for Afghanistan, and the military wants to end in a victory, wants to put a period at the end of this long war, and they aren't able to do it operationally. And in some ways, I think is reducing those troops. I don't believe President-elect Biden would do much difference. We needed someone to finish that for us. And I think that's, and the negotiation, as difficult it has been and unsuccessful as it has been, is a legacy. Finally, turning to the Middle East, as much as U.S. policy towards the Middle East, again, has been very focused on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and that relationship and an overly concentrated bias towards Israel, I think we do have to recognize that the Abraham Accords, they're not going to change either. The fact that we have UAE, other countries recognizing Israel, that's a significant issue that the Biden administration is going to build on. The fact that the shift has been made to Jerusalem, which countless presidents have been saying that they would do, that's not going to change either. But obviously, there's going to be a much more different tactical approach to that. So again, this is the most difficult thing. You have to take the president out of this equation, and you have to start looking at those contributions. And finally, I think there's been a continuity in some ways from the Obama administration to the Trump administration of retrenchment, of course, correction on globalization, much more protectionism. We see that in Europe as well. And so those strains, I think, are going to continue substantively, but of course, tactically, a Biden administration is going to act very, very differently. I know we'll get into that in subsequent conversations. So those are some thoughts to get the conversation started.
Brilliant, Heather. Thank you very much. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Well, back to your question. I think, many non-Americans are always a bit flummoxed by the swings and turns of American foreign policy as we have different presidents. I think my colleagues have already addressed some of the specifics. I think it's useful to step back and say, what's the deeper trend here? How do we understand this, the Trump legacy? Because I think it's not, as Heather said, it's not just about a person. There's something else going on in American society that I think is quite important to kind of focus on. Foreign policy begins at home. And it's not just about what America does around the world, it's what Americans debate who they are as a society. And those debates then have the foreign policy implication. So let me just do a quick kind of summary of different trends in US society that I think are affecting this debate. If you want to read about it, Walter Russell Mead has done a wonderful book called Special Providence, which talks about this. But Donald Trump tapped into a deep trend in American society that often goes unnoticed abroad, but occasionally comes up, which Mead calls the Jacksonians. So it's named after Andrew Jackson, a president in the 19th century. But these are not distinct schools. They're sort of, trends and waves of societal thinking. But it's a strong current that's been in the American Republic for hundreds of years. It's not always the dominant one, but for the last 4 years, it was the dominant one. And that is that the Jacksonians, if you will, aren't particularly worried about the rest of the world. They're just trying to get on with their lives at home. And if the rest of the world, they realize is a dangerous place, threatens the United States, well, by God, we'll go out and take care of that problem on our own, thank you, and just deal with it and come back home. The idea of alliances, entangling multilateral structures, all of this is anathema to that sort of way of thinking. You don't want to be tied down. It's a nationalist agenda. It's a zero-sum world, basically. The old U.S. traditions of unconditional surrender, if you think about World War II, that's very much part of this kind of tradition. And the president tapped into that minority thought and captured the presidency at a strange moment in our history. But the other trends are, I argue, the ones that Joe Biden has captured in a remarkable coalition. These cut across Democrat or Republican. The one that most people know are Wilsonians. These are Americans that are out crusading for democracy around the world. They are the ones that say America will be safer in a world where there are more democracies. It's not a pacifist ideology. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most interventionist presidents we've had, but it reflects that sort of broad internationalism that is part of the coalition Joe Biden has put together. The second one is more the Obama types, which are Jeffersonians. And it was the thinking here that the best influence America can have in the world is not to go change the rest of the world, but to perfect the American experiment at home. That we are not credible as a beacon to other countries if we can't get our own act together and live up to what we say we stand for. And that is, in a way, is retrenchment, as Heather said. And you saw that in Obama policies, but comes from a very different premise than the Trump retrenchment. And then the last piece of the coalition is what they're called the Hamiltonians. I like that name, but it's named for Alexander Hamilton. It was a Broadway's rock star, as you may know. But his argument at the time was big power competition, and you simply work out rules to manage competition, including through trade agreements and other types of structural things that you can work out. I think what Joe Biden did was capture those three trends into a new kind of coalition. Whether they hold, I can't tell you. But Trump had only one tradition. And if you look at history in previous administrations, every successful president has usually had a domestic coalition of at least two of those traditions. And that's where Trump, I had argued before, he never expanded his base in order to be sustainable. I think my analysis, I think, is right. But I think that explains the point going forward is that one should not underestimate that the Jacksonian tradition in the United States is strong. It'll continue. Whoever's face is on the front of it, it doesn't matter, just to recognize it's a pull on the American debate that sometimes makes Americans do things they do that others don't quite understand. And it makes, for outside observers, maybe American foreign policy less predictable than many would hope.
Thank you very much, Dan. As a historian, I'm a great admirer of Walter Russell Mead, so thank you for bringing his work into our debate. Carlota, let's have a European and indeed a Spanish perspective on Trump's legacy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles, and thank you very much to bring to me this opportunity to be in this amazing panel. I think, first of all, that when we want to talk about Trump's legacy, we have to distinguish between two theories. On the one hand, we have Donald Trump's critics. According to them, the president hasn't made America great again. He has made it weaker than it's ever been. For these critics, he has failed to rebalance the relations with China. He failed to deal with North Korea. He failed to end the endless war in the Middle East. He failed to intimidate Iran. He failed to stop European free riding. And that's before one considers his record of undercutting or destroying all kinds of international treaty, on climate change, trade, or nuclear weapons. And on the other hand, we have Trump supporters. For them, this is unfair because the president has finally reversed Barack Obama's weakness. He put America first. He ripped up bad deals. He forced allies to pay more for their own defense. He led the global change in attitude against China. He defeated the Islamic State, and he kept the US out of any new wars. But I think these two theories, the critics and the supporters, miss the main thing, the real significance of Trump's presidency. For me, it was his ability to upset the apple cart dramatically in foreign policy. to bring into question the bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. So Trump, through a combination of ignorance or instinct and ego, he pointed at the reality and demanded to know why it was being allowed to continue. Why was America still fighting wars in the Middle East? And why wasn't it partnering with Russia, for example, against the Islamic jihadists? Why was China allowed to abuse the rules of the game? Or why were American workers losing their jobs? Or why American workers were paying for the Europe defense? I remember there was an article on Foreign Affairs, and somebody argued that Trump had offered some correctives to the illusion of the past, but often rudely and sometimes inconsistently. So I think to bring into question some of the assumptions of the US foreign policy is not always a bad idea, but you have the other side of the coin. Trump wasn't able to provide any right solution. And because Trump wasn't able to provide any right solutions, we have to deal with the consequences of his policy. And I think the main consequences is a new form of skepticism. Jeff underlined this issue. Biden will be confronted with a new kind of skepticism among international partners, that any agreement they may negotiate today could be called into question after another change in the White House, maybe in 2024 or maybe in 2028. I think the second consequence is Trump's use of the American power has encouraged demands in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, in other places around the world for greater autonomy, for American power. We have to remember that on the one hand, Trump diminished the American soft power, and on the other hand, he misused the hard powers. For example, the killing of the Iranian general Soleimani, or when he dropped on Afghanistan in 2017, the mother of all bombs, or even when he imposed sanctions on business working with Iran after the US pulled out of the JCPOA. So we saw this new style, this new use of the American power. But at the end, Trump was unable to impose his will on Iran, for example, and the European Union has not given Trump what he wants on tariffs, and China has not given way on trade or anything else. No, and the third consequence, I think, is the damage of the U.S. image. The U.S. is not a model anymore, and for example, for Europe, Europe's view of America is changing. Simon Cooper wrote an article like the Financial Times again, and the title was "Why Europeans No Longer Dream of America." He wrote that European attitudes to Americans were shifting from envy to compassion, and I think he added that there were more chance of becoming a billionaire in Scandinavia than in the US, pointing to this widening inequality in the US and the end of the American dream. For sure, Trump didn't cause this change in Europe's view of the US, but for sure he was an accelerant. And finally, I think we have to remember that Trump is in the White House until January. So we already have to wait to the consequences of his policies in this transition period. Heather underlined, he's pulling back troops from Afghanistan, from Iraq, maybe from Germany, maybe from Syria. This is going to have an impact maybe in European countries. And we have to take into account, and I'm ending that transitions period are more vulnerable. If you remind, the 9/11 Commission identified the delay in the presidential transition in 2000, the recount in Florida, as one of the causes behind what amounted to the most consequential terrorist attack on US soil. So I think this is something important. We have to wait until January.
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. These transition periods are always tricky and never trickier than now. So let me now invite you to look forward, to try and project forwards and try to help us identify those policy areas and those regions of the world where you expect least change under a Biden administration, and also where you expect the Biden administration to depart most significantly from the Trump administration's foreign policy. Jeff, over to you.
Sure. I think the biggest foreign policy shift under Biden will be an emphasis on democracy versus authoritarianism. Unlike the global war on terror that dominated George Bush's presidency and a large part of Obama's as well, I think unlike Russia as the main threat or China as the main threat, I suspect there'll be one big basket labeled authoritarianism that will constitute the main focus of the Biden presidency. We'll see what happens with a summit for democracy taking place in 2021, which would be difficult enough to organize even in the best of times, but much more difficult now. But I think rather than just seeing this as a single meeting, I suspect this will be an ongoing initiative with a lot of resources devoted to pro-democracy movements, civil society organizations, and so forth. And I think as a basis for this, if you look at some of Biden's speeches and statements over the years, if you go back, for example, to his speech in Copenhagen in 2018, or his foreign affairs article earlier this year, or even references to this in the Democratic platform, I think this will be a major aspect of the Biden administration's foreign policy. And with this, a stronger opposition to various authoritarian governments, especially those that were outspoken in support of Trump, including within NATO. So I suspect you'll see a much tougher line being taken against Turkey, against Hungary, even against Poland. Now, in terms of regions, I'd imagine Africa will be a major area where we will see change, at least in terms of the amount of high-level attention and new initiatives. With respect to Middle East policy, I think it will remain mostly the same with 3 exceptions. On Iran, there'll be an effort to get back to where things left off before Trump, especially on the nuclear deal. Although at this point, the Iranians may have other ideas. Biden will probably try to at least appear to take a more even-handed approach to the Israel-Palestine issue, though in substance, I think little will change, I think, to go back to Heather's point. On Saudi Arabia, I expect the relationship to become much cooler, with Yemen being a major point of contention in the first instance. In Europe, you'll see a major effort to repair relations, especially with NATO, with much less overt criticism of allies and defense spending. I think there'll still be the criticism, but it'll be less out in the open, and probably a bit more flexibility on the 2% issue, especially given the impact of COVID-19. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a downplaying of US-UK relations, and I'm especially looking forward to seeing whether the bust of Winston Churchill in the Oval Office survives Biden's first day in office. Clearly, the relationship with Russia will shift, though I actually think the ball is now in Putin's court. If Putin is willing to deal with Biden on nuclear arms control and cut back on the propaganda and subversive activities in a noticeable way, then perhaps there might be some hope of improving our relations, at least somewhat, from their current dismal state. But I personally have little expectation of this, partly because of Putin, but also because the US government doesn't really have an interest in cutting a serious arms control deal with the Russians that would include putting missile defense on the table. And if Trump is waiting in the wings for a return to power, I suspect you'll be seeing a great deal of him on Russia today. On Latin America, I think you'll mostly see continuity when it comes to Venezuela. As for Cuban policy, Biden may be somewhat hesitant to restore relations to what they were under Obama, given what happened with the sort of strong support amongst Cuban Americans for Trump. Albeit, short of actually invading Cuba, I don't think the Democrats have any chance of capturing that vote. I think Biden actually has an opportunity to be much bolder on normalizing relations with Cuba, but he's more likely to be cautious. With Asia, I think basic continuity in terms of China policy, minus the trade war, so I sort of largely agree with Heather on that point. Biden's team has been very, very quiet on North Korea, which I interpret as them not having much of a clue what to do. I think one final point to make, which I think is fundamental to understanding the Biden administration's foreign policy going forward, is that it's going to be heavily influenced by the need to boost Kamala Harris's prospects for the presidency in 4 years' time. I see Biden as a one-term president, and keeping Trump from returning to office will inevitably be a major underpinning theme of Biden's foreign policy. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. Heather, over to you. So we're making some serious predictions going on here.
I've got to say, we're just trying to get through the transition right now, but I appreciate the boldness of the prediction. I think, again, we're probably going to be a little repetitive here, so I'll go fairly quickly. In the continuity side of the ledger, China, there will be a continuation of toughness towards China, both on the economic side as well as the security. And I think, again, the politics of this in the United States, anything that a Biden administration that they will do vis-a-vis China that appears to be soft, the Republicans are going to charge that they're being soft on the communists. And so you're just going to get into a cycle where I think there's just going to be very little flexibility to show anything other than toughness, which does speak, I think, to a broader concern about making sure that this does not slide into a conflictual relationship. I mean, on Russia, there's always been two policies of the U.S. government on Russia. One, the President Trump informs, and then the rest of the U.S. government. And so I think you'll actually just see a more clear interagency focus on Russia. Again, remember, I think for the Democratic Party, this is a consequence of the election interference in 2016. There's an element of that party that wants to punish Putin and Russia severely. There's another side of the party that, the traditionalist party, that is growing extremely concerned about where the arms control debate, the deconstruction of arms control architecture, that we have to get into a dialogue here. And I think that's an unresolved question. Some of the personalities may resolve that tension between sort of the punishment and the we need to engage Russia. But I see, and this gets, I'm going to slide a little bit into obviously the democracy, human rights, the anti-corruption. I'm going to put that is the discontinuity where a Biden administration has told us that anti-corruption is going to be a major pillar of their democracy, rule of law, human rights, and that gets to the kleptocracy and authoritarianism. I see, and this is, again, putting President Trump out of the equation, you had Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun and others engaging much more in Belarus. Of course, Ukraine remains an issue. The post-Soviet space, whether that's Nagorno-Karabakh, Moldovan presidential elections, Georgia is in turmoil right now. I see the dynamics in the post-Soviet space being a place where a Biden administration would be much more engaged on that front, and that could, again, be viewed from Moscow as a much more confrontational. Just to Kalada's point, look, there's no going, like, resetting the clock back to 2016 when it comes to North Korea or comes to Iran. We've already blown way past that. And you can set your watch. North Korea will test this administration and will test this transition period. I mean, you can just bank on it. And of course, the inaction of the Trump administration on North Korea has led us to a much more difficult position, and of course on Iran as well. But the two big differences that I will just again highlight, this is going to be an allied-centric approach to all of these questions. And this is what we didn't have. We were trying to address these challenges inconsistently while we were challenging our allies on the trade front, on the policy front. You know, if this is a real allied-centric approach, then we're going to work with our allies first to make sure we have an agreed to position, and then we're going to go meet those challenges. That's the theory. Whether the timing and the challenges work to that advantage, we will have to see. My last comment is, please understand, again, the background here. The United States is going to be under increasing budget constraints that addresses military spending, the domestic forces in our country. We still don't know if the Senate will be in Republican hands or Democratic hands. We'll know that in January after the two runoff elections in Georgia. But this is going to be, it's still a very evenly divided Congress on appropriations as well as foreign policy. How that swings, we're going to have to find policy issues that both sides agree to. We like our government gridlocked, so one side doesn't have too much of an advantage over another. That will be the case. So we're going to have to develop some bipartisan approaches here, or you're going to continue to see the U.S. not being able to engage. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I try not to repeat things. On the great power competition frame, I think what the Trump administration did would lump Russia and China into the same box, and they're just very different challenges. And I think you'll see the Biden administration piece that out differently. Joe Biden himself said, Russia is our greatest threat, China is our greatest rival. And you might think that's just a semantic difference, but I think it has some implications. So I think you'll see a change there. I think on China, as Heather just said, the instinct is to turn to allies to have a conversation together about what China's rise means. It'll include European allies, but also Asian allies. It's not just a transatlantic conversation. But it's an opportunity for Europeans to come now. I suggest the frame is the one the EU has come up with. Where together do we believe China can be a partner, like climate change maybe? Where do we think it is a competitor, where we actually share many concerns economically in particular? And where do we think it is this systemic rival? The EU has said this, but I think the lack of thought on the EU side, if I may say, is on that last piece, systemic rival. What's that mean for the European Union? I haven't seen a whole lot of detail behind that slogan. So we need to tease that out. That would be a new way to work. On Russia, I think you will see, Joe Biden's not a pal of Vladimir Putin, like Donald Trump was. And so he has said, Russia's going to have to pay for all the violations it's been engaged in. And you can bet he will have that tough approach. But I think you'll also see pressure on the administration to work with Russia in areas where you're not working with them because it's a favor to Moscow, it's because it's in your own interest. So extending the New START agreement, which he'll have to do within 2 weeks of taking office, would be a quick thing. Anything you can do together to build down the risk of accident, miscalculation, bumping into each other with your militaries is, I think, something that they would want to explore. So it's a different approach with Russia. It's not, balancing it in any reset, but it will be something different than what we've seen with Trump. And I think the Congress, by and large, would support a lot of that. I think the other main things, just because I don't think they quite were mentioned, just to say, right off the bat, he has said he will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Here, I think Europe might not be prepared for the other thing he said, which I haven't seen any Europeans really understanding. He said he will host within 100 days a global climate summit. So that preempts, in fact, the Paris process that's underway, because that calls for a summit next fall in Scotland. So I think Europe needs to understand the US is now not only going to accelerate the climate diplomacy, it might overtake Europe faster than anybody is ready to embrace, unless he can disentangle that sequence and think of maybe 2 summits. One's about a new bar, setting a new bar with the US right there with you. And then secondly, how do you implement these new types of agreements? The other area where I think you could look for some change is on the JCPOA, the arrangement with Iran. But I think it'll be a higher bar again. I'm not necessarily sure we'll come back to it, because I think personal view, I should say, these are all my personal views. I'm not representing anyone here, just so we're clear. What about Iran's, not just nuclear activities, but what about its failure to recognize Israel? What about its support for terrorism? What about its efforts to undermine its neighbors? Those all have to be part of this debate with Iran. It's not about just nuclear anymore. And I'm not sure that the European colleagues are prepared for an answer to that request from the US to rejoin that type of process. You'll see a need to just rejoin the WHO. Trump has said we're leaving the WHO. Well, we were not leaving the WHO, thank you, but we need to reform it. But let's reform it from within the organization. You'll see the president say we need to reform the World Trade Organization. But again, instead of blowing it up like Donald Trump did, he'll say, let's work within it to change it, to make it effective. And there again, Europe, Japan, other key countries, we have very similar views on how to do that, but we have to do it now. Another one that President Trump was taking us out of, I think as of Saturday, this Saturday, because of the 6-month notification, is the Open Skies Treaty. That was announced months ago, but actually I think it takes effect on Saturday. I don't know, open skies in terms of technical provisions is not really needed, but the premise of open monitoring and so on is important. And I think you could see an administration say, you know, we'll stick with it. So on all those things, you see a real change. I wanted to just end by focusing on Europe. If you bought my earlier premise, my premise was that there are deeper trends in American society than who's president that affect U.S. relations with Europe and how the United States relates to Europe. For 70 years, the U.S. has been what I call a European power. It has been integral to all the coalitions and elements of what the Europeans do themselves to make the continent stable and prosperous. The last number of years, the past decade, has seen the U.S. start to change from being a European power to what I call a power in Europe. It is a flip of phrase, but it really makes all the difference. It's not comprehensively engaged, it's selectively engaged. It's not necessarily wedded to European integration. In fact, it prefers to pick off the Europeans and pit them against each other because frankly, it's so easy to do. It has a different sense of its interests in the European continent than one that's comprehensively engaged. That's a deeper trend going on in American society. It's not about a particular party. I think Joe Biden's coalition has arrested that trend, and he is the most transatlantic president since Bill Clinton, personally. So his instinct will always be to turn to Europe. He called it Europe our, quote, partner of first resort on all issues. So that's his instinct. Whether his administration, always goes by that, I can't say, but there will be a sort of an arrest of that deeper trend that I've been talking about. Whether it's sustainable, it really depends more actually on Europe and how Europe will engage on these issues than on the United States. And that affects the burden sharing issue that was mentioned. It's important to remember the 2% goal was set by Joe Biden and Barack Obama. It was not set by Donald Trump. Trump tried to take credit for it, but actually the trend reversed before he took office. So it's hard for Joe Biden to go back on his own goal. But I think you can, if you think about the nature of security today, I think you can set that 2% goal in a different context of the kinds of security challenges we face. I would argue we need to focus much harder on what I call resilience as a security concept, that disruptions to societies, to critical functions of the societies, is as much a security challenge today as thinking about tank armies and traditional territorial-based security. And yet we don't even have the right vocabulary for how to deal with this together, and we should. So I think if you can reframe what is security and count resilience contributions as part of that contribution, I think you have a new way of talking. It's not about retreating, and it's certainly not about counting development aid as security, which is seen in the United States as an excuse that Europeans use, frankly. Let's talk about real security and what is it and how do we contribute? I think that would offer a better basis going forward. If I could say, we have a couple legacy issues that one can't forget. The privacy shield was rendered invalid between the US and the EU about regulating all personal data. The digital economy is becoming the economy. The densest links in the world are between the US and Europe, and yet we have different regimes for how to deal with it. We have to sort that out. In Europe, people like to talk about the Brussels effect of regulatory policy. In the US, we talk about the California effect. But we should be very clear that there is something called the Beijing effect. And who sets the norms and standards now becomes really sort of the next frontier of our relationship. We have to deal with that first between ourselves before we can turn elsewhere. And I just end with the point Heather made at the end also. One cannot be surprised that the Biden administration on the first day of office will have to deal with what I call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are all problems at home. It's the pandemic. Today is the worst day of the pandemic since we started it in the United States. It's not, we never got out of the first wave, and it's just getting worse. The vaccine is not going to help us anytime soon, and the distribution issues and so on are a huge challenge. The economy is in, the tank because of all this, and all of the inequalities that Carlota had mentioned have come to the fore because of that. We have a social reckoning in this country because of systemic racism and the inequalities on top of that, both of which have been brought out by the first two problems. And then you have the legacy of Donald Trump, the polarization, the need to heal the nation. Joe Biden is going to have to deal with that. That has got to be his priority. That's not isolationism, but that's how European commentators will start to treat it. It's the basis for the United States to be a reliable partner, because if we cannot help ourselves, we can't help anybody else. So I would consider, rather than always think about the traditional foreign policy agenda, how can our common domestic challenges, Spain's going through the same awful health issues now that everyone else in the economy, let's turn that into a common basis for transatlantic cooperation. A transatlantic recovery initiative would be one way to start it. Removing trade barriers to vaccine distribution, to medical supplies, would be an easy step across the Atlantic. There's no reason why we couldn't do things like that. It would set a major signal that we're in this together, and we're facing common problems at home. These are not issues of distraction, they're issues for better partnership.
That's excellent, Dan. Thank you very much for giving us so much food for thought. I've asked Carlota to answer a specifically Spanish-oriented question here. So Carlota, what are the likely consequences, or what is the likely impact of the Biden administration on Spanish-US relations? Thank you.
I think, first of all, that Spain and maybe Europe must help the US to regain its lost reputation. His image has declined, his image has been damaged, and I think it's in our own interest to help the US to regain its lost reputation, its image. Why? Because if you don't have the support of the public opinion, it's impossible to the Spanish government to try to build or to rebuild or to negotiate, whatever. So I think that's the main point. We must help the US to improve its image. And then, I mean, there's an idea. We have been talking about transatlantic reordering or rebuilding the bridges, and always without taking into consideration a new generation on the both sides of the Atlantic. A new generation that is much more diverse, that has completely different backgrounds, socially, culturally, technically. And with a new generation, you have new priorities. Maybe with a less militaristic, defense-oriented view of the war. And when you come to the transatlantic relations, this means one thing. The de facto foundation of the US-European relations for so long has been the NATO alliance. And if that is the lens through we continue to view the relationship, then we risk losing this new generation. So one of the priorities should be to refocusing the US-European relations through the lens of the US-EU relations. Of course, NATO is extremely important, but with a stronger US-EU relations, we are going to be focused on climate change, on human rights, on structural inequalities, technological issues, digital issues. So we are going to include this new generation. And I think this idea, we have to bring this idea to the Spanish domain, because I do believe the relationship between Spain and the US could and should grow even more. And this is the way to do it. Apart from this idea, I think we should try to reverse the imposition of tariffs on Spanish products. I think we can't negotiate this with a Biden administration, and I do think that this is possible because Biden distinguished between friends and enemies, and in this case, this is something that we can reach. Secondly, I think we need to pay attention to the Biden's infrastructure plan. this can be a huge opportunity for Spanish companies. I think this is a possibility, even if the Senate is going to be a Republican Senate, because this is a bipartisan dream. I mean, it was a promise of Trump, and Biden also promised it. So I think this could be a reality. This can be a huge opportunity for Spanish companies. Also, Biden emphasis on clean energy. This is also another opportunity for Spanish companies. And I say this because I would like to underline that despite large asymmetries, the bilateral economic relationship has become recently more balanced. I would like to say that the flow of the Spanish FDI to the US has been significantly developed, particularly of the past 15 years. Spain is the 9th largest investor in the US and one of the fastest growing investors. So in strategic economic terms, the US is a priority for Spain. On defense issue, a key component to the bilateral relationship, we must wake up strategically and show the US and the Biden administrations that we are a strong and able partner, that we continue to have a role as a gateway to the rest of Europe, to the Mediterranean and to Africa. This is something that we need to reinforce, to insist to the Biden administrations that we continue to be a gateway to Europe, to the Mediterranean and to Africa, but not only in defense terms, but also in economic terms, in technological terms, in digital issues. And then, I mean, another idea, the US and China and Spain are among the 3 top investors in most Latin American countries. With a Biden administration, maybe the US and Spain could act together to redefine alliance and to secure Western economic and geostrategic interest in the region. We can work together in order to reinforce efforts to develop democracy and to improve the rule of law in the region. And finally, I think Spain should not wait until the inauguration day to put its ideas on the table, that now is the time to input ideas into the Biden transition team, because after January 20th, Biden is going to be too busy looking inward. I think stop here.
Thank you very much. I hope someone from the Spanish Foreign Ministry is listening to us this afternoon. I'm sure they are. Okay, we have some interesting questions coming in. We only really have about 10 minutes, and we have actually covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm very grateful to you for that. A couple of very specific things. First of all, an interesting question. How serious do you think the damage has been in institutional and decision-making terms? In other words, is there anything that has been damaged beyond repair, for example, in terms of the future role of the NSC, the National Security Council, or in terms of the credibility of US diplomacy, and also the prestige and the self-perception of US diplomacy? I understand as many as 20%, this listener says that as many as 20% of US diplomats have actually resigned and left their positions during the course of the Trump administration. So more broadly then, perhaps, how much of this damage is structural, and how much is there something that can bounce back with a new administration? Perhaps Heather, I could ask to answer that, since she's based in DC, like Dan. There are also several questions about a likely Biden administration in terms of personnel. Who do we think might be occupying the key slots? DOD, state, NSC, etc. And also, what role will the vice president play a significant role? One of you did mention that in passing. Perhaps Jeff, you could take that. And thirdly, a question on the so-called special relationship with the UK. Remember when it existed? And assuming there is a deal next week, as we are told there will be, between the UK and the EU, what kind of relationship do you see the Biden administration trying to develop with the UK. Given in particular Biden's Irish background and his concern about the Good Friday Agreement, which I'm told is actually a real issue and not just something that journalists like to talk about. Heather, if I may.
Thanks, Charles. Great question. So this has been a norm-shattering experience over the last 4 years, and I think we shouldn't shy away from it. I think we need to fully address it. In fact, that norm-shattering experience is accelerating through this transition period. With the firing of officials that disagreed with the president, the fact that you had administration officials fighting and not agreeing to appear before Congress and fight of subpoenas. I mean, this has been altering to how we believed our institutions and our norms worked. So for me, the question is, how do we proceed? Does a Biden administration go back to how it was and try to shore those up? Or is the experience that if the one side doesn't play by the rules, why should we play by those rules? And so there's that instinct as well, which is understandable. But this has absolutely profoundly challenged the intelligence community and how they pass information, between the impeachment and the overt politicization of issues like Ukraine, that everything is on the table, everything is weaponized. I mean, either there's a sort of a bipartisan truce that cannot happen again, or we're going to slide into, I think, an area which gives all of us great pause. I'll just throw in 2 cents on the US-UK special relationship and the Irish issue. I think today's announcement from Prime Minister Johnson on defense spending is a signal to a future Biden administration that the UK will be a strong security, defense, and intelligence partner. It understands the importance that President-elect Biden has on Ireland. And you're absolutely right, Charles. That's not because there's nostalgia for the Good Friday Agreement. He actually really believes that. So that, I think we will see that dynamic. But look, for the United States, regardless of who's in the White House, we need a strong UK to come through this experience, economically strong as a security and foreign policy actor. We need a strong EU coming out of this experience as well. And so I hope that we have a new look at whatever happens at the end of this year, beginning on January 1st. This has in part been, unfortunately, where the Trump administration has not played that role of a European power, as Dan said, and we need to reassert ourselves and try to manage this for both sides as best we can and to strengthen the United States.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Actually, before I answer that question, just one last point to follow up on Carlotta's statements about where Spain fits in, where it could fit in. Just one thing to add, which is that with this emphasis on a summit for democracies, if you recall with Obama's his nuclear security summits, 2 of them were actually held abroad. 2 of the 4, I think it was 2 of the 4, maybe even 3 of the 4, but at least 2 of the 4 were held abroad. One in Korea, and I think the other one possibly in the Netherlands. So I think Barcelona or Madrid would be an excellent place to hold one of those, set against the backdrop of Spain's transition from Franco and so on and so forth. In terms of sort of US-UK, I was quite amused to see, you might have seen that clip of the BBC reporter asking Biden just after the announcement that he was elected, hi, I'm from the BBC, and then saying, yes, do you have a statement for me? And then, yes, I'm Irish. But having said that, I suspect that Biden will more or less fall into line with sort of traditional US-UK relations, with the exception being that he'll probably spend more time with somebody like Merkel in her final days and try to push more of the relationships with Germany and France as opposed to the UK. So perhaps a more even-handed approach to that. But in terms of defense relations and so forth, I don't see any change whatsoever. In terms of Harris and foreign policy, I think she will play a major role. And this will be traveling around the world, doing a lot more when it's safe to travel around the world, that is, but being much more active on the foreign policy front than many vice presidents have been to date. I think partially that's an issue of giving Harris more foreign policy experience on the one hand, but also because we have to remember that Biden is getting on a bit in years, so there's only so much that he can do as well physically. So I think that's going to be one limitation for him. As far as foreign policy names and who might actually feature, I mean, there's sort of this list of people: Blinken, Flournoy, Sullivan, Rice, et cetera, et cetera. Biden having this foreign policy, more or less government in exile, waiting to come into power, that's been with him now for months at the very least. By one count, it was a couple of thousand foreign policy experts divided up into dozens of working groups, and so on. So I think, in terms of manning the new administration, unlike the Trump presidency that actually had this problem initially, if you recall, of trying to find people to actually staff the government, this isn't going to be a problem at all, at least in terms of choosing people. The problem is going to be, and this I think goes to, I can't remember if it was maybe Heather or Dan's point, in terms of Republican obstructionism. So especially for the senior posts, the extent to which the the Republican Senate potentially is going to obstruct the appointment of various people, probably starting at the top with Susan Rice as a potential Secretary of State, given that they have criticized her in the past for things like the Benghazi and so on and so forth. So that might be problematic, and whether the Biden administration does it Trump, sort of follows the Trump route and appoints a lot of temporary people to temporary positions as opposed to permanent. We will see, although I think Michelle Flournoy is a dead cert as far as the Pentagon is concerned. But I think one crucial thing about that, actually 2 points about that. The first is that and Heather mentioned this point about trying to cut back on defense spending and so forth. With Flournoy in charge of the Pentagon, I think it'll be just the opposite. She's probably going to try to increase defense spending to the extent that she can, or at least to try to maintain this dominance of the Pentagon relative to the State Department and USAID, which have been talked about as far as more resources being devoted to them. But sort of as the final point, I would say that one big question mark, and this relates to the question that was asked in the first instance about the National Security Council. One big question, similar to the Obama administration, was who actually holds the power on foreign policy decision-making in this administration? Will it be the NSC, which I think was more akin to the Obama years, or will it be at the Pentagon or the State Department? So where that power is will be quite crucial.
Thank you. Dan, I'm going to add another question to your already overloaded plate, because someone would like to know your views as to whether President-elect Biden will be able to work effectively with President Macron, who, by the way, recently gave an extremely interesting interview, which is sort of 400 pages long, very much in the Macron style, which I hope you've had a couple of weeks to read. And given in particular, that he really is pushing this strategic autonomy pitch very, very strongly now. So the question, Dan, basically is, how do you see that playing out as well?
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I'll try to be very brief. I want to underscore Carlotta's point about US-EU. I think one thing you will see different is Biden administration try to create finally a truly strategic partnership with the European Union. It doesn't mean relegating NATO. It simply means it's the other strand of our relationship, and it's dysfunctional. And we have to get this on track. So I think you'll see an initiative, personal view, to really, create something new. I was involved, the last time we did this, 1995, called the New Transatlantic Agenda. That's still the framework. Nobody uses it, but it was a very big effort to try to create this.
And launched here in Madrid, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. Chris helped write Secretary Christopher's speech in Madrid, in fact. So the point is, we need to get this right. It's dysfunctional. It's not working. In fact, many things NATO wants to do, it has to do with the European Union. So it's in our own interest to do this, and we need to get over theology. So I think you'll see something there. On the UK, it's a difficult thing. I think, President Biden's election means Boris Johnson was put in a box on his own strategy. He really has to have a Brexit deal now. And he can't fool around with the Irish border. He knows that. So, these are critical elements where the U.S. election made a difference in the Brexit terms. And I think you'll see that play out now. If it doesn't, then the UK really is, not only not special, it really will go to the end of the queue. Because these are really fundamental issues. They're not about President Biden. The entire Congress is focused on this, and it's bipartisan, especially about the Good Friday Agreement and anything that impinges on that. It's not about Joe Biden being Irish. It's a fundamental interest of the United States. So, U.S. is ready to come down a ton of bricks on London on that issue, and one should be very clear about it. But what's likely to happen, no matter the agreements, what is likely we're going to see in January is just a very murky situation. The UK-EU relationship will not be sorted out even if there is an agreement. It's going to be very, very strange. A lot of transition. You're going to see the US-UK relationship also trying to get sorted out anew with the UK not being in the EU. And then the UK-US relationship is also undergoing a change because of the trade agreement that's being negotiated. That's not going to get done either. So all of this is going to fall in the lap of a new administration. I think the only guiding principle at the moment, I would think, is we need to have all three legs of that transatlantic triangle remain strong. UK-EU, EU-US, UK-US. And whatever we do, we need to approach it all at the same time to make sure that all kind of moves together. There are lots of details, but if that's the guiding frame, then I think we'll get it right. But it'll take some time. And that takes to France. The strategic autonomy phrase, in my view, I wish somebody could explain it to me. It's a buzzword that politicians like, but I don't know what it means. It has been used in the last few years as sort of a voice of emancipation. They say at one point we just need to be autonomous, but then they say we need to be autonomous from you, and it's sort of a declaratory thing. It's been a reaction to Donald Trump in many ways. It's a product of its times. I do believe, frankly, it's going to fade because it doesn't have any deeper substance. If you're in a marriage and you say to your partner, I want to be autonomous from you, you don't quite understand what they're talking about. And the details then get important. I think what you're going to say, with the most transatlanticist presidents you've seen, there'll be a coming together. So instead of using that term, which is just divisive and is empty, let's focus on where I think that term is trying to go and where we agree, which was Europe needs to be more capable. A more capable Europe is the basis for a transatlantic meeting of the minds. If French soldiers who want to go to Africa to fight Islamists don't need to be flown there in American planes because they can't fly there themselves, that would be a contribution. If Europeans don't need to rely all the time on the US, military getting them from places or using their logistics or communications, that would be a contribution. So whatever the Europe wants to do to show it's more capable, what is it exactly? Show us the list. What do you want to create? What's the product? Not more process, which irritates the Americans because it's all about process and not results. I think if you can turn that phrase into something that's about a more capable Europe working with the United States, then you're going to have something, and the U.S. will support that. We want to be less engaged in Europe in all the old ways of the partnership we have had. And I would just end on that the mistake I think Europeans are going to make is to breathe a sigh of relief, you already see that, and say, oh, thank God, now we can go back to business as usual. That's a mistake. This administration will not want to go back to business as usual. It wants to reinvent the alliance for the future. It wants to position our relationship for the issues we have to deal with at us now, not some nostalgic view of things. And that's going to expect far more of Europe, not less of Europe. So as Carlotta said, use the time now, 2 months right now, do your homework. What is it Europe's ready to offer to the United States? Not helping America, with all due respect. We don't need you to help America. We need you to step up. That's going to be the tough love message, if you will, about a new reinvented alliance.
Thank you very much, Dan. I very much agree with that. I think strategic competence or strategic responsibility are more useful terms than strategic autonomy. I think we Europeans basically have to decide, first of all, what it is we want to do together, which is in itself a pretty tall order. And then we have to decide whether we do actually have the ability to do this by ourselves and without asking others for permission. But it shouldn't be a matter primarily about autonomy or independence from the US. And I agree with you, those marriage metaphors can get one in a lot of trouble. So I'm afraid we've run out of time. That was outstanding. Thank you so much. We've got lots of other interesting questions coming in, contrary to what I said earlier when we were off the air. And that is definitely your doing. So thank you so much, Heather, Jeff, and Dan, and Carlotta. That was really a fantastic debate. And I hope we can meet again, preferably in the flesh, if not through another of these debates, say in a year's time, and reevaluate some of the things that have been said in this very juicy, very meaty 70 minutes that we've had together. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to you. Have a great day. Stay safe. And thank you again for joining us. Goodbye now.